In this video, I'm going to show you how easy it is to make bunting using a fat quarter bundle and some bias binding. I've made a template out of card that is 9 inches across and it is 8 inches down, because this is going to give us a fairly decent size bunting flag when it's sewn. You will also need a fat quarter bundle. The one I've got here is patterned, but you can use plain or patterned, whichever is going to suit your needs and your intended purpose for your bunting once you've made it. I've also got white bias binding, but obviously you can use any coordinating colour bias binding that is going to match your bunting best. To get started, we're just going to use our template. I've got a rotary cutter that I'm going to use to cut my material, but material scissors will do an equally as good job. And we're going to start to cut out the triangles out of our fat quarter bundle. My fat quarter bundles are 18 inches by 22 inches, but you can buy varying sizes, or if needs be, you can just buy material if you've seen material that you'd like to use for your bunting. Once you've opened your material, we're going to cut 2 triangles out of each piece of material that we're going to use for our bunting flag so that we can sew them together. Line up the flag on your material. It doesn't matter if the top of your material isn't perfectly neat, because we are actually going to sew over that. So we're just going to pop that on there, and I'm just going to cut along the edge. So there we have our first triangle cut out. Repeat this process now for as many bunting flags as you wish. I'm going to cut 1 each out of each of the pieces of material. Once you've got all the pieces of material for your flags, we're going to pin them together by putting them right sides together. Using some glass head pins, I'm just going to pin them in a couple of places so that it's just going to hold the material together whilst I sew them, and I'm going to repeat that for all of my flags. Now we have our pile of pinned flags. I do like to prepare the bias binding. For the bias binding, I like to fold it in half, and I just like to press it, as I find that this really helps when it comes to securing it to the top of our flags. So I'm just going to use my Easy Press Mini, and I'm just going to press it to form a crease, and I'm going to do this for as long as I think I'm going to need for all my flags. And I'm also going to take into consideration that at either end of the bias binding, I need to leave a gap that's going to allow me to hang the bunting as well. Now I've prepared a pretty decent length of the bias binding. I haven't cut it yet because I don't know exactly how long I need it to be. So rather than waste any, I'm going to cut it once I've sewn all my flags in. Now we're ready to get sewing our bunting flags. For the sewing, I'm just going to be using white thread, but obviously if your bunting is different colours, by all means change the colour of your thread to match that accordingly. I'm not too worried about doing the back stitch at the start and end of the flag because I'm going to be covering the top with bias binding. I'm going to sew down to the bottom, and when we get down to the bottom, we're just going to sew up the other side. Once you've sewn up the sides of the first flag, we're just going to repeat that with all the flags that we're going to be using on our bunting. Once all the flags have been sewn, we're just going to go along and we're going to trim off the loose edges, and then we're going to turn the flags inside out, and we're also going to trim along the point at the bottom just to try and give a neat point when our flag is turned over. When you're ready and you've cut all the loose threads, just flip your flag the right way round. I've got a wooden dowel, and we're just going to push out the bottom as best we can. You could also use like a knitting needle or a crochet hook or something like that that's going to help you make the point at the bottom. And there we have our first bunting flag. Don't worry about the top pieces because in a moment we can just trim those off. Now we have all our flags turned the right way around. They're still looking a little bit on the tatty side. So to rectify that, I'm just going to press them all and trim off any of the top pieces just to try and level them out a little bit. Using my heat press mini again, I'm just going to give it a quick press, especially along the crease lines, just to try and make it look a little bit more finished, ready for when we sew it to the bias binding. And the pieces that are along the top, I'm just going to give those a trim off, just to try and make it level. If you do have any frayed edges, you can just trim them off, but the bias binding is going to cover all of that up. And there we have our flag looking a lot neater now. So I'm now going to repeat that process with all my bunting flags. Now we've got all our flags pressed, we're ready to start adding them to the bias binding. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a 2-inch loop at the end of the bias binding so that I can hang it on a wall. So we're just going to fold that over. I'm going to measure 2 inches and I'm just going to pin that. Before I add in my flags, I like to leave a 3-inch gap, just to leave a bit of a space from where it's hanging till the flag starts. First flag I'm going to use is a white one. I'm going to do alternative white and black. I'm going to open up the bias binding, and we can see now where we ironed it, and this is where it becomes beneficial. So we're going to place the flag inside the bias binding along the crease line, and then we're just going to fold it over and pin it. And I think that makes it so much easier than trying to do it without it being ironed. Then we're just going to hold that in place with a few pins. It's totally your preference when you're placing your second flag, whether you leave a bit of a gap in between the flags or you start straight away and leave no gap. I think I'm going to leave no gap for mine, so then they'll be almost touching. And again, we're just going to do the same, place the flag up to the crease and then just pin it. And then we're going to repeat this now for as many flags as you are placing on your bunting. Now we've attached all the flags to the bias binding, I'm just going to repeat the same measurements as what I did at the start so that when it's hanging it looks symmetrical. So I'm going to add a 3-inch gap, and then I'm going to leave another 4 inches so I can fold it to make a 2-inch hoop, and then I'm just going to cut the bias binding. Now we're ready to sew the final part of the bunting, so I'm going to change the stitches on my sewing machine to a zigzag stitch, just because I think it's going to look a bit more decorative. The first thing we're going to do is we're just going to stitch along here to secure the tab. Then we're going to start stitching all the way along the bias binding with the zigzag stitch, just to attach the flags to the bias binding, and then our bunting will be done. I'm going to pop the bias binding under the needle. I've changed it to the middle size setting of the zigzag stitch, and I'm now just going to stitch forwards and backwards a couple of times just to make the hook. And we can see there that that's secured that nicely. So now I'm just going to sew the zigzag stitch all the way along the bias binding until I get to the end, and I'm going to do the same to make the hook at the other side. And now we have our completed bunting. I think it's stitched it really well. You can do a bigger zigzag stitch if you want, or if you prefer, you can just do a straight stitch. Now your bunting is ready to be used. These are also great for selling on places like Etsy and can be tailored to match any decor. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed seeing how easy it is to make bunting. If you make some bunting, please feel free to send me some pictures in the comments, as I would love to see what bunting you have made. Thank you very much for watching, and I will look forward to seeing you in my next video. I can see you on my camera, can't I? Hey, I can see you on my camera.